What if one sentence could silence an entire room of powerful senators? Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. They thought it would be clean. A tightly choreographed hearing. Headlines pre-primed, cameras tuned. Senator Elizabeth Warren seated in the chairwoman's spot, her back straight, a manila folder resting on the table like a loaded weapon. She wasn't here to ask questions. She was here to deliver judgment, and everyone knew it. Across from her, Vice President Denzel Washington sat still. No aide, no stack of rebuttals, just a leather notebook, worn, stitched at the spine, resting beside his folded hands. He hadn't moved since the hearing began. Some thought he looked arrogant, others said calm, but none of them noticed the difference. The lights overhead hummed. The moment came 23 minutes in. Warren didn't clear her throat. She didn't soften the blow. She just leaned forward and said it. "Mr. Washington," she began, her voice clear, precise, broadcast ready. "Before we move to your prepared remarks, the committee would like to address several inconsistencies in your public financial disclosures." Eyes flicked across the chamber, phones tilted slightly higher. Even the CNN anchor's posture changed. This was the moment they'd been briefed about. Warren lifted the folder, flipped it open with the kind of theatrical crispness only paper can make. She didn't look at him when she spoke. She looked at the room. "Your 2022 filings omit reference to a private asset vehicle, registered under a third-party holding group, used to purchase real estate in Nevada, Arizona, and New York. These properties total just under $7 million. Would you care to explain, Mr. Washington?" No movement. Warren smiled, tight, rehearsed, because to the American people, that looks like concealment. It looks like someone is hiding money behind shell companies while talking about integrity. She closed the folder. That sound was louder than it should have been. Denzel's expression didn't change. His hands remained still, but somewhere behind the eyes, a current shifted. Warren leaned in. "Not done. You're sitting here in front of this committee as a man who's built his entire reputation on discipline, service, and transparency. But when that transparency applies to you, suddenly your paperwork is missing." The room rippled. You could feel it. A low-grade anticipation that comes right before blood is drawn. This wasn't a question. It was a public stripping. The chairman didn't interrupt. He didn't blink. He wanted the cameras to keep rolling. Warren stood now, one hand on the desk. "So I ask again, what are you hiding, Mr. Washington?" Still no answer. And then it happened. Denzel didn't raise his voice. He didn't reach for papers. He didn't call on staff. He just turned his head slowly, deliberately, until his eyes met hers. The air compressed. What he said wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. "Before you question what I own," he said, his voice low, steady, shaped like iron, "you should ask who owns you." The sentence didn't land. It detonated. One gasp. 3 pens dropped. A phone buzzed and was immediately silenced. Warren blinked. Once, slowly, her lips parted like she had something to say but forgot the shape of it. The sound in the room wasn't silence. It was vacuum, the kind that happens when gravity shifts and nobody's sure where up is anymore. Denzel didn't move, didn't blink. His words just lingered, still hanging between them like a slow-building storm. Across the dais, a junior senator's hand hovered over his mic, unsure if he was about to object or ask for clarification. He didn't do either. Warren stepped back slightly, just a fraction, just enough for anyone paying attention to notice. She tried to recover, smiled again, but this time it didn't fit. Her voice came softer. "Are you refusing to answer the question, Mr. Washington?" Denzel tilted his head just slightly, not as a gesture of defiance, but recognition. He'd seen this moment before. He'd lived it, not in hearings, but in classrooms, airports, boardrooms, studios, places where people ask you for your truth, only so they can rewrite it the moment it scares them. He looked at the chairman. "I'll respond," he said calmly, "but not yet." The chairman raised an eyebrow. "There's context," Denzel added, "and context, Senator, is the difference between evidence and theater." The chamber felt colder, not because of temperature, because control had changed hands, and no one realized until it already had. Warren sat back, but she didn't speak. Her hand tightened around the folder's edge, as if that paper might protect her from something larger than facts. Denzel reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out the leather notebook. He didn't open it. Not yet. He simply placed it on the desk in front of him, tapped it once with his finger. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time since the hearing began, it wasn't a battle anymore. It was a countdown. The hearing had started precisely at 9, but the storm had formed days earlier. 3 mornings ago, Denzel sat quietly at his Capitol office desk, eyes scanning the tightly printed memo his aide Marcus Hale had brought in. Marcus stood stiffly by the door, his posture unusually tense, like someone delivering news he wished he didn't have to. "They're planning something," Marcus said quietly. as if speaking louder would make the threat more real. The committee's legal counsel requested an unusually deep review of your financial statements. They didn't notify us directly. I only found out through a friend. Denzel didn't respond immediately. Instead, he lifted a worn leather notebook from his desk and carefully flipped through the pages. Handwritten notes, old and meticulous, filled every margin. Marcus watched him, confused. He expected anger, maybe even frustration, but not silence. Should we respond publicly? Marcus asked cautiously. No. Denzel shook his head gently. They want us to respond. That's the play. Draw us out, make us defensive before the cameras even roll. If we move now, we're dancing their dance. Marcus shifted his weight slightly, uncertain. But if we don't respond, the media will speculate. Denzel interrupted calmly. Let them. Truth is slow, lies move quickly, but quick movements tire themselves out. Marcus hesitated, nodded, and moved toward the door, but stopped, hand resting on the frame. Sir, they're digging for something. Are we certain there's nothing they'll find? Denzel glanced up, eyes steady and unflinching. Nothing they can use honestly, but they'll find plenty they can twist. They always do. Marcus nodded again and quietly stepped outside, leaving Denzel alone. The vice president leaned back, leather notebook still in his hand. He knew how these things worked. He'd been in enough rooms like this to see the strings attached to every accusation, the hidden hands pulling them. He also knew the kind of people who accused first, rarely considered their own closets. He opened his notebook again, turning slowly until he reached a folded sheet tucked carefully between pages. It was a receipt, small, slightly creased, anonymous cash donations traced discreetly to a senator's campaign fund. The senator's signature wasn't explicitly there, but the initials EW were clear, the handwriting unmistakable. For days he'd debated whether to use it. Marcus didn't even know it existed. It had arrived quietly, slipped under his office door weeks earlier. No sender, no address, only two typed words accompanied it. They know. Denzel folded it carefully back into place, closed the notebook, and set it aside. His father had once told him the most dangerous thing in a fight was revealing your weapon too early. Truth doesn't shout, his father used to say. It waits to be heard. 2 days passed. Denzel spent his evenings rereading memos and quietly watching the news as speculation mounted. Journalists hinted at scandals, pundits debated Washington's silence, and the committee carefully arranged the stage for their performance. Yet Denzel remained silent. No public statements, no press conferences, just the quiet routine of preparation and patience. On the night before the hearing, Marcus appeared at Denzel's office again, clearly troubled. They've scheduled the hearing for prime time, national broadcast, CNN, MSNBC, even Fox. It's everywhere. Denzel looked up slowly. I expected as much. Sir, Marcus hesitated, looking carefully into his boss's steady gaze. If you have something, anything to counter this, tomorrow's the day. The whole world's watching. Denzel's eyes drifted down toward his closed leather notebook. The world's always watching. That doesn't mean they see. The following morning, the Capitol building felt different, charged, as though even the walls anticipated conflict. Cameras and lights filled the chamber. Technicians adjusting angles, reporters practicing intros, staffers whispering urgently into phones. Warren's aides moved through the crowd, meticulously orchestrating their moment. But Denzel Washington arrived alone. No entourage, no counsel. He stepped into the chamber calmly, the leather notebook under his arm. The room watched in silence as he took his seat. Warren avoided eye contact at first, speaking softly to the chairman, checking notes and rehearsing carefully prepared lines. She expected anger. She expected counter-arguments. She expected resistance. She did not expect silence. The hearing began exactly as planned. Warren laid out allegations one by one, precise and cutting, her words engineered to inflame suspicion. But Denzel remained motionless, not responding, not engaging. After her final accusation, when he finally delivered his devastating sentence, "Before you question what I own, you should ask who owns you," the room went silent. The senator faltered, momentarily frozen. The media scrambled for clarity. The power dynamic had shifted completely. Now, as he calmly placed his notebook down, the senator's eyes nervously darted to the folder still resting in front of her. She hesitated, uncertain. Before regaining composure, her voice slightly strained. "Mr. Washington, this committee requires your full cooperation. Are you prepared to respond now?" Denzel glanced down at his notebook once again, fingers gently brushing its worn edges. He let the silence stretch, just long enough for the entire room to lean forward. "I'll respond when the moment calls for clarity, Senator. Right now, your committee prefers confusion, and I don't play in shadows." He leaned back slowly, folding his hands once more. Warren sat motionless, stunned. She'd planned every detail, anticipated every reaction, rehearsed every outcome, but the quiet man sitting across from her hadn't followed her script.
And for the first time in days, as the cameras rolled, as the media waited, and as the world watched, it became clear. Denzel Washington wasn't here to defend himself. He had come to redefine the game entirely.
The silence lingered like smoke after an explosion. Cameras hummed softly. Technicians held their breaths. And the senators seated around the dais shifted uneasily, sensing something larger was unfolding. Warren glanced quickly toward her aides, their eyes wide, uncertain how to proceed. They'd rehearsed every potential outcome but this one. Denzel slowly lifted his eyes again, his gaze calm but sharpened with intent. Without speaking, he opened the worn leather notebook in front of him, flipping carefully until he found the folded receipt placed neatly between its pages. He removed it gently, setting it quietly on the table in plain sight. The room strained to see what lay there, a small piece of paper, insignificant yet suddenly central. Warren, sensing danger, attempted to speak first. "Mr. Washington, theatrics aren't necessary here," she began, voice slightly uncertain. "This committee requires no theatrics, Senator," Denzel said, voice steady but firm enough to cut her off cleanly. "Just truth. You asked what I'm hiding. Perhaps you'd prefer to explain first." Warren's eyes narrowed briefly, her voice sharpened, defensively rising. "Explain? Explain what, exactly?" Denzel carefully raised the small slip of paper, his movements slow, precise, deliberate, cameras zoomed in, lenses adjusting for detail. It was a single receipt, clearly visible, handwritten initials at the bottom, E.W., the senator's initials. "This is a record of a donation, Senator," Denzel began evenly, eyes never leaving hers. "A cash donation deposited anonymously, funneled through a third-party account, linked back to you through signatures and timestamps. But strangely enough, nowhere mentioned in your disclosures. Perhaps you'd prefer to elaborate on that." A ripple moved across the gallery. Journalists quickly typed, scribbled, whispered rapidly into earpieces. Warren froze, suddenly rigid, her hand gripping the folder tighter, visibly shaken by the unexpected reversal. Denzel didn't press harder. He didn't raise his voice or point his finger. He let the quiet settle again. He knew truth had weight. Sometimes silence made that weight unbearable. The chairman cleared his throat awkwardly, attempting to regain control. "Vice President Washington, this committee isn't here to question Senator Warren. Please, then perhaps this committee misunderstands the nature of transparency." Denzel responded calmly, eyes shifting briefly toward the chairman, firm and resolute. "Transparency isn't selective. You cannot demand clarity from others while obscuring your own mirrors." The chairman hesitated, shifting uncomfortably, glancing at Warren for guidance. She offered none, frozen and trapped in the slow-motion disaster of her own making. Her careful preparations had shattered, leaving her defenseless. "Senator Warren," Denzel continued, quieter now yet sharper, "you framed this hearing around hidden assets and questionable ethics. You spoke of concealment and corruption. I merely offer clarity. This paper, this simple receipt, is evidence of precisely what you claim to stand against." Warren finally attempted to recover, voice shaking slightly. "That paper proves nothing. Anyone could fabricate it." Denzel interrupted gently. "Of course, that's why I didn't rely on paper alone." He reached again for his notebook, calmly pulling out a small black USB drive, placing it gently beside the receipt. The gallery's whispers intensified. "This drive holds records," Denzel explained, voice steady and deliberate. "Digital trails linking anonymous donors, third-party accounts, and your campaign staff, edits made by aides, transfers quietly approved. It's remarkable how diligently digital records are preserved." A tense pause followed. Warren's mouth opened slightly, no sound emerging, eyes locked on the small USB drive as though it might explode. "I'm not accusing you of corruption, Senator," Denzel said quietly. "I'm merely pointing out the selective transparency this hearing seems designed around. If we question my holdings openly, surely we must examine yours just as thoroughly." Across the dais, senators glanced nervously at one another, shifting in their seats. Warren finally spoke, voice brittle, barely maintaining control. "These accusations are unsubstantiated." "Not accusations, Senator," Denzel said, cutting in firmly but quietly, voice unwavering. "Facts, evidence, the sort of transparency you said you wanted. If honesty frightens you, perhaps transparency isn't truly your aim." The chamber settled into a heavy quiet again. Warren sank slightly into her chair, eyes darting toward her aides who frantically whispered among themselves, urgently scribbling notes they weren't sure how to use. The chairman, hesitant and visibly uncomfortable, spoke softly into his microphone. "Perhaps we should take a brief recess." "No need, Mr. Chairman," Denzel interrupted calmly. "I've made my point." He leaned back, fingers gently brushing the worn notebook again, not opening it, simply letting its presence anchor his resolve. Warren watched him silently, defeated yet defiant, her carefully scripted narrative dissolving rapidly around her.
The committee chairman cleared his throat awkwardly again, voice shaking slightly. "We'll resume questioning in 15 minutes. Reporters scrambled toward exits, phones ringing urgently. Staffers hurried from the room, whispering excitedly, already crafting new headlines. Warren remained frozen in her chair, disbelief etched clearly into her expression. Denzel sat quietly, notebook in hand, gaze fixed calmly forward. Marcus, seated discreetly behind him, exhaled softly, watching with relief. The aide had expected defense, but not this calm, surgical dismantling. No anger, no raised voice, just quiet certainty. As senators filed slowly from the chamber, murmurs and glances filled the air, speculation growing louder. Warren finally stood shakily, visibly diminished, whispering sharply to her aides as they hurried from the room. Denzel didn't rise. He remained seated alone at the witness table, notebook resting in front of him. He knew this wasn't over. The system would push back, spin narratives, and rewrite intentions. He understood the weight of what he'd just done. But as Marcus approached him quietly from behind, softly placing a hand on his shoulder, Denzel nodded once in calm acknowledgement. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to, because he'd done something much more powerful than simply defending himself. He'd held up a mirror, and the reflection it revealed was far more dangerous than any accusation could ever be.
When the committee returned 15 minutes later, the room's atmosphere had shifted entirely. Senators re-entered cautiously, whispering anxiously, avoiding eye contact with Elizabeth Warren, who sat stiffly in her chair, eyes fixed downward, her earlier confidence now frayed and faded. The murmurs in the chamber were hushed but relentless, speculating, questioning, second-guessing. Denzel hadn't moved during the recess. He remained seated, the worn leather notebook still neatly placed before him, its presence now carrying an unspoken threat. Warren had attempted to regain composure in private, her aides frantically preparing damage control behind the scenes, but none of that seemed to help as she settled back into her chair, visibly shaken. As the chairman softly cleared his throat and reopened the proceedings, Warren forced herself upright, struggling to reclaim authority. Her voice, once poised and assertive, now sounded hollow, diminished. "Mr. Washington," she began cautiously, measuring each word as though navigating a minefield, "you've presented unexpected information. If these claims are genuine, I trust you'll cooperate fully and submit these materials for independent verification." Denzel tilted his head slightly, regarding her calmly. "Senator Warren, I already have," he replied quietly, clearly, without hesitation. "All digital records contained on this drive were submitted securely to the Senate Ethics Office early this morning, time-stamped and independently confirmed. I trust the committee will find them illuminating." A ripple moved swiftly across the chamber. Warren's face paled visibly, lips tightening, her gaze darting nervously toward the chairman, who suddenly looked deeply uncomfortable. This revelation was news to them. They had expected resistance or evasion, not quiet, surgical cooperation. Denzel continued smoothly, voice steady, controlled. "But since transparency is our shared goal," he continued softly, "allow me to clarify precisely what this evidence reveals." He reached forward calmly and activated a small remote control on the table before him. Behind the senators, a screen flickered to life, instantly capturing the full attention of every journalist and observer in the room. Warren turned sharply, her eyes widening in alarm, clearly caught off guard by this unexpected move. The screen filled slowly with images of scanned documents, transaction records, timestamps, and encrypted file paths. Highlighted clearly were digital edits, changes in budget allocations quietly approved by Warren's committee office, each transaction marked by date, time, and a digital signature unmistakably traced back to one of her senior aides. "Here," Denzel said evenly, voice unwavering and precise, "are documented transfers of federal funds, discrete reallocations, that ended up in accounts closely linked to organizations advised directly by your brother, Senator Warren. Each move approved silently, digitally obscured, encrypted and intentionally hidden from public records." The senator stared blankly, color draining from her face. Senators around the dais shifted uneasily, their whispers dying abruptly as evidence scrolled methodically across the screen. Denzel didn't pause for drama or accusation. His tone was gentle, but each word landed with devastating clarity. "I'm not suggesting criminal intent, Senator, but since you raised concerns about ethics and transparency, I believe we must discuss openly these carefully hidden arrangements. Would you agree?" Warren sat frozen, unable to reply, her carefully scripted narrative utterly demolished, leaving her with no prepared response. The chairman awkwardly cleared his throat, clearly shaken. "Vice President Washington," he began nervously, "these are serious claims." "Not claims, Chairman," Denzel gently interrupted, voice calm, patient. "Facts, independently verifiable, documented clearly. Transparency demands we acknowledge what these records plainly show. The American people deserve clarity."
The room felt colder now, a chill deeper than the air conditioning. Senators exchanged anxious glances, some leaning closer, urgently whispering instructions to aides who frantically typed and scribbled notes. Warren sank back in her chair, expression hollow, desperately searching for a recovery path that didn't exist. Denzel slowly leaned back in his chair, fingers lightly brushing the edge of his notebook again, speaking quietly, but clearly enough for everyone in the chamber to hear. For years I've seen this system operate behind closed doors, hidden transactions accepted as normal business. This isn't personal, Senator Warren. It's about a culture that believes itself above scrutiny. We've grown comfortable expecting questions only go in one direction. Perhaps it's time we ask ourselves, who benefits from the silence we maintain? His voice softened further, almost gentle, but devastatingly firm. This isn't an accusation, it's an invitation to acknowledge openly what we know privately, to confront honestly what we prefer not to see. Warren attempted to respond, her voice trembling. This is misleading. Then clarify it, Senator. Denzel interrupted quietly, respectfully, but unyieldingly. You wanted transparency. Now you have it. Warren looked away sharply, unable to face him, her words faltering into silence. The chairman, visibly distressed, quickly adjourned proceedings for another brief recess, realizing he'd lost all control over the narrative. As senators filed quickly out, urgently whispering, avoiding eye contact with Warren, the gallery buzzed with frantic speculation, phones vibrating, news alerts multiplying. Denzel sat quietly, unmoving, calmly closing his notebook, aware the message had been delivered. Marcus approached again cautiously, softly whispering from behind, "Sir, reporters want a statement." "No statement needed," Denzel responded quietly, steadily, eyes still fixed forward, calm and sure. "Truth speaks clearly enough by itself. Let them hear it." Across the room, Warren finally rose shakily, hurriedly retreating to her private office, aides scrambling around her in panic. She avoided glancing back toward the witness table, unable to face the quiet man who had just dismantled her strategy. As the room emptied, Denzel remained calmly seated alone at the table. He didn't relish what he'd done. He took no pleasure in causing discomfort, but he'd learned long ago that honesty was uncomfortable precisely because it was necessary. He had no illusions this battle was over. Powerful interests would respond fiercely. Narratives would be reshaped, counterattacks already planned behind closed doors. But for this brief, quiet moment, he allowed himself the certainty that he had done what mattered, not simply defending himself or his reputation, but holding up a mirror to a system long accustomed to operating unseen, unquestioned, and unaccountable. And now, reflected clearly in that mirror, were faces of those who'd believed themselves untouchable, suddenly confronted with a truth they could neither deny nor ignore.
Denzel returned to his office quietly, his footsteps measured, calm, echoing gently through the long marble corridor. Marcus followed closely behind, matching his pace silently, aware enough to not disrupt the quiet reflection of the moment. The Capitol building felt different now, its corridors subdued, whispers and urgent phone calls filling offices behind partially closed doors as news spread rapidly from the hearing room. Inside his office, Denzel moved deliberately toward his desk, placing the worn leather notebook carefully onto its polished surface. Marcus hesitated in the doorway, sensing his boss's reflective mood, uncertain whether to speak or remain silent. "They'll push back hard, sir," Marcus finally ventured softly, his voice cautious, respectful, tinged with concern. "This won't end easily." Denzel nodded gently, not lifting his eyes from the notebook. It wasn't meant to. Marcus stood quietly for another moment before speaking again, voice barely above a whisper. "The media already wants statements. Senators are demanding clarifications. Warren's office is scrambling, preparing counterclaims." Denzel exhaled slowly, finally glancing upward. "Of course they are. It's all they know." Marcus paused again, uncertain, then reached quietly into his jacket pocket, retrieving a small, plain white envelope. His eyes avoided direct contact, discomfort clear. "This arrived during the hearing," he explained softly, placing the envelope carefully onto the desk. "No sender. Security cleared it." Denzel regarded the envelope for a long moment, its blank surface, offering no hints, no clues. He nodded gently, silently acknowledging Marcus, who quietly stepped back and left the room, closing the door gently behind him. Alone now, Denzel lifted the envelope carefully, feeling its slight weight, sensing the quiet urgency it represented. He carefully broke the seal, removing a neatly typed single sheet of paper from within. As he read, his breath stilled. "I worked closely with her office," the letter began plainly. No greeting or pleasantries, its tone direct and cautious. "I saw the edits, witnessed the encrypted transfers, and the reallocation of federal resources. They told me transparency would cost me my job. Silence was required. Loyalty demanded. I'm sorry I waited this long." There was no signature, only initials. M.K. Denzel read the brief message again carefully, feeling the quiet gravity of its words settle deeper. The hidden system he had exposed was larger and deeper than he'd revealed at the hearing. He'd expected resistance, but this was confirmation from within, a voice, frightened but courageous enough to quietly defy the silence demanded by power. Gently, deliberately, he folded the letter and placed it carefully inside the leather notebook. A small tremor of responsibility, of obligation, passed through him. This was no longer about a single hearing or a political rivalry. It was about confronting a culture that relied on fear and secrecy. He knew that clearly now. Just as he quietly considered his next move, a firm knock sounded at the office door. Marcus entered again, visibly troubled, his normally composed expression strained. "Sir, security just detained someone downstairs in IT," Marcus announced softly, urgency clear in his voice. "He was attempting to access our servers remotely, specifically targeting your recent submission to the ethics office. Security suspects he intended to alter or remove evidence." Denzel absorbed this calmly, barely reacting outwardly, eyes steady and focused. Who was he working for? Marcus hesitated, clearly uncomfortable, his voice dropping lower. "He's a former consultant, contracted previously with Senator Warren's committee, officially terminated 6 weeks ago, but still active informally, according to security." Denzel leaned back slowly in his chair, exhaling softly, recognizing the deeper implications clearly. He understood this wasn't simply a reaction to embarrassment or scandal. It was a calculated attempt to erase transparency, to conceal evidence once more beneath layers of silence and intimidation. "Where is he now?" Denzel asked gently, voice steady. "Detained securely," Marcus replied softly. "Security suggests involving federal investigators immediately. Attempted interference like this is a federal crime." Denzel interrupted calmly, finishing the sentence gently for his aide. "Yes, Marcus, inform them. Provide all necessary cooperation." Marcus nodded, preparing to leave once more, but paused at the door, hesitating again. "Sir, they're playing hard. If they're desperate enough to risk federal charges." Denzel nodded slowly, eyes thoughtful. "Then they understand clearly what this means. They know the threat transparency poses to the system they've built." Marcus lingered briefly before stepping quietly outside, leaving Denzel alone once more, the quiet weight of responsibility and truth pressing silently upon him. He glanced toward the leather notebook, its quiet presence steadying him. He reached forward gently, fingers brushing carefully against its worn surface, absorbing its reassuring familiarity. He knew precisely how this would unfold. Powerful interests would circle, counterclaims manufactured, distractions created. Yet beneath it all, beneath the noise and reaction, the quiet truth would remain steadfast, patient, undeniable. He rose slowly from his chair, moving thoughtfully toward the wide windows of his office, gazing quietly outward at the city beyond. Sunlight reflected softly from the distant rooftops, shadows shifting gently along sidewalks below. His father had always taught him the value of silence, how its quiet power could unsettle louder, more chaotic forces. Today, that wisdom felt especially relevant, especially necessary. Truth, he understood clearly now, didn't need volume or force. Its quiet presence alone was formidable enough. Behind him, the notebook and its quiet contents rested gently on the polished desk. Somewhere within the building, federal investigators moved purposefully, evidence collected, accountability quietly pursued. The system he had calmly exposed now scrambled desperately, seeking shadows, seeking silence once more. But Denzel had no intention of retreating or shouting louder. He understood the calm power truth carried inherently. His mission wasn't to accuse or destroy. It was to quietly illuminate, steadily reveal, and patiently confront. Turning quietly away from the window, he moved again toward his desk, lifting the leather notebook gently, understanding clearly its quiet, steady power. He wasn't fighting alone. Others had begun quietly stepping forward, courageously adding their voices, softly defying the silence once demanded of them. The battle ahead wouldn't be quick or easy, but in quiet, deliberate steps, Denzel felt more certain than ever. Truth was patient. It could afford to wait. Later that evening, the capital grew quiet as the day's chaos slowly settled into uneasy stillness. Senators had retreated behind closed doors, while reporters hovered anxiously outside offices, whispering speculation into their microphones. The media had its narrative, fragments of truth blended with confusion, all swirling restlessly, waiting to be shaped by morning headlines. Inside his office, Denzel sat quietly, the small lamp on his desk casting a gentle golden glow across the darkened room. The worn leather notebook rested silently before him, its presence steady, reassuring and patient. His fingertips traced its smooth edges absent-mindedly as he let himself reflect on the weight of what had transpired earlier. A soft knock at his door drew his eyes upward slowly. "Yes," he answered calmly. Marcus entered quietly, carefully closing the door behind him. In his hands he carried another envelope, this one small and slightly worn, with handwriting that Denzel immediately recognized. Marcus approached gently, placing it respectfully onto the desk in front of him. "This arrived personally, sir," Marcus said softly, sensing its significance. Security cleared it. He quietly thanked Marcus, who stepped away discreetly, leaving Denzel alone once again. He didn't immediately open the envelope. Instead, he gently held it in his hands, feeling the slight tremble in his fingers, recognizing its quiet intimacy. After a long moment, he carefully broke the seal, unfolding the handwritten letter inside. He exhaled softly, feeling the quiet power in each word. "My dear son," the letter began simply, handwriting slightly shaky yet determined, gentle strength radiating through each sentence. "I watched today, quietly from our old kitchen, seeing clearly what others failed to recognize. You didn't defend yourself. You defended truth. That's far more powerful, and much harder." Denzel's eyes softened, absorbing her words, the letter continuing gently. "Do you remember those early mornings, the long walks to school, cold and quiet streets around Mount Vernon? Your father's prayers always reminding us the quietest voices sometimes carry the loudest truths. Today I heard your voice echoing his wisdom. It reminded me that strength doesn't need noise, doesn't need applause, doesn't even need victory. It simply needs courage." His throat tightened slightly, memories surfacing quietly, vividly. The warmth of the small kitchen, the scent of hair oils from his mother's small salon lingering on his clothes, his father's sermons delivered softly from the pulpit on Sunday mornings. Quiet lessons, absorbed patiently, stored deeply within him. The letter continued gently, each line infused with dignity and quiet strength. "They'll fight you now, harder, louder. But don't fear the noise, son. It's proof you've struck the right chord. Stand quietly firm. Hold your ground gently, respectfully. You're not fighting for reputation or position. You're simply speaking truths others can't afford to acknowledge. That makes you dangerous and necessary." Denzel carefully folded the letter, feeling deeply its reassuring weight, gently placing it inside the worn leather notebook, alongside the other quiet, powerful messages he carried with him. A slow, quiet knock again sounded at his door. He breathed deeply, gently granting entry once more. Marcus quietly stepped inside, hesitation visible in his posture, eyes respectfully lowered. "Federal investigators have asked to speak directly with you, sir," Marcus explained softly. "They have questions about the individual detained attempting to alter evidence." Denzel nodded gently, rising quietly from his seat. "Tell them I'll cooperate fully, anything they require." Marcus hesitated briefly. "Sir, reporters outside are becoming persistent. They want statements, comments." "No statements, Marcus," Denzel gently interrupted, his voice calm and reassuring. "Let silence speak. They'll understand clearly enough." Marcus nodded softly, recognizing the quiet certainty in his boss's demeanor, and quietly stepped away, closing the door gently behind him. Alone again, Denzel allowed himself a quiet moment of reflection, the reassuring wisdom of his mother's letter echoing softly within him. He understood clearly now that his role wasn't simply revealing hidden truths, it was bearing witness to them calmly, respectfully, relentlessly. He knew exactly how this would unfold. The system would fight fiercely, noisy counterattacks would erupt publicly, efforts to undermine his credibility intensifying. Yet amid all the noise, quiet truths would patiently persist, waiting calmly beneath the chaos. He moved quietly across the room, the familiar leather notebook gently in his hand, stepping toward the wide windows once more. Outside, the evening lights of the city gently flickered to life, illuminating sidewalks and streets below. Quietly indifferent to the battles fought behind Capitol walls, his mother's gentle reminder echoed again softly in his mind. Strength didn't need noise. Courage required no applause. Truth simply needed patience, resilience, and quiet determination. He gently pressed his hand against the cool window pane, feeling its steady reassurance. Tomorrow, battles would resume, noise would intensify, narratives would twist. But he'd remain quietly firm, standing steadily, patiently waiting, ready. For now, in the quiet solitude of his office, he allowed himself this small moment, calm, certain, reflective, to remember exactly who he was and why he stood there. He was not fighting for headlines or political victories. He stood quietly for those who couldn't, those whose voices had been silenced beneath the weight of fear and secrecy. Tomorrow would demand courage, quiet strength, steadfast resolve. But tonight he stood silently, feeling quietly certain, and it was enough. The next morning arrived quietly, sunlight gently breaking through scattered clouds, illuminating the Capitol's marble columns and polished floors with an almost peaceful glow. Yet beneath the quiet elegance of the building, tension brewed silently. Conversations hushed, eyes wary. News outlets had worked relentlessly through the night, crafting narratives, shaping public opinion, and preparing for a day they expected to define the vice president's career. Denzel arrived at the hearing room calmly, stepping through the double doors with deliberate grace, his expression quiet, composed and confident. Senators shifted subtly in their seats, glancing nervously as he entered. Elizabeth Warren sat rigidly at the dais, her posture tense, gaze fixed firmly downward, carefully avoiding eye contact. Cameras and microphones lined the walls again, journalists whispering hurriedly into earpieces. The nation was watching, waiting, quietly anticipating the outcome of this confrontation. Denzel moved slowly toward the witness table, gently placing the leather notebook on its surface again, a subtle reminder of truths patiently carried. The chairman softly cleared his throat, signaling proceedings to resume. Warren hesitated briefly before finally lifting her gaze toward Denzel, voice strained, words carefully rehearsed. "Vice President Washington," she began, tone carefully neutral, yet visibly defensive. "Yesterday's session revealed unexpected accusations. This committee intends to investigate thoroughly. You've provided significant evidence. However, we ask your cooperation in clarifying further." Denzel nodded gently, acknowledging her words quietly, respectfully. He waited a brief moment before responding, allowing the silence to settle gently within the room. "Senator Warren," he began softly, calmly, voice steady and gentle, "I've never hesitated in providing transparency. Yesterday was not an accusation. It was simply clarity. Clarity that this system fears deeply. I stand ready to cooperate fully." Warren visibly flinched, his quiet sincerity unsettling her carefully constructed defenses. The chairman shifted uneasily, sensing control slipping again toward Denzel's quiet, undeniable presence. "If I may," Denzel continued gently, speaking quietly, yet every word landing with unmistakable strength. "Transparency isn't about blame or politics. It's about recognizing honestly the silence we've maintained. It's about admitting to ourselves the quiet compromises we've accepted as normal." He paused gently, eyes carefully scanning the senators seated before him, their faces uneasy, yet quietly attentive. "You asked yesterday what I own, Senator Warren," he continued softly. "I own the truths I speak openly, but perhaps more urgently, we must ask ourselves who owns our silence." The chamber remained gently hushed, senators exchanging cautious, quiet glances. Warren leaned slightly forward, attempting again to reclaim control, her voice brittle, defensive. "You've accused this committee, Vice President, of selective transparency." "No," Denzel quietly interrupted, voice calm, patient, respectful, yet firm. "I accused no one. I simply illuminated the truths you preferred hidden. Accountability isn't an accusation, Senator. It's an invitation." He reached gently toward the worn notebook resting quietly before him, opening it slowly, deliberately, retrieving the folded letter from his mother, and holding it gently between his fingers. "My mother reminded me recently," he continued softly, gently unfolding the letter, its quiet authenticity palpable, "that strength doesn't require noise, victory doesn't demand applause, and truth doesn't seek comfort. She taught me that the quietest voices sometimes speak loudest, simply by having courage enough to remain steady, honest, patient." He carefully placed the letter down again, eyes gently meeting Warren's now uncertain gaze, his words calmly relentless. "I didn't enter public service for applause or reputation," he explained softly, voice steady and sure. "I stepped forward because silence protects only those who fear truth. Today this committee must decide clearly what we value more, the truths that challenge us, or the silence we've quietly maintained." The chamber held its breath quietly, senators shifting uncomfortably yet unable to look away, recognizing clearly the quiet power resonating through every calm, measured word. "I've provided evidence. I've cooperated openly," Denzel continued gently, voice calm and unwavering. "But transparency isn't one-sided. If we truly value it, then it must extend equally, without hesitation or selectivity. I invite this committee and this nation to embrace a new courage, not loudness, not confrontation, simply honesty, clearly spoken, patiently pursued." His words gently filled the quiet space, calmly echoing within the chamber. Warren's expression softened slightly, resistance quietly fading, replaced gradually by quiet resignation, and something else, a subtle acknowledgement of respect. The chairman quietly cleared his throat again, finally speaking softly, his voice noticeably subdued. "We appreciate your candor, Vice President Washington," he said carefully, "and assure you this committee will examine fully all you've presented. Perhaps." Denzel nodded gently, quietly agreeing. Senators rose slowly, subdued and reflective, quietly exiting the chamber. Warren lingered briefly, eyes quietly meeting Denzel's steady gaze, uncertainty and respect silently exchanged. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly, before leaving quietly herself, aides gently guiding her away. Alone briefly in the chamber, Denzel exhaled quietly, feeling gently resolved. Marcus quietly approached, voice softly respectful. "Sir, reporters are waiting. They're demanding your reaction, your thoughts." "No reaction, Marcus," Denzel gently interrupted, voice quietly certain. "Just the truth. The reaction belongs to them." Marcus nodded softly, understanding deeply, quietly stepping aside, allowing Denzel to rise gently from his seat. He collected quietly his notebook, letters safely within, gently carried in his hands. He stepped slowly, thoughtfully from the chamber, aware clearly that battles would continue quietly behind closed doors, narratives reshaped, counterclaims quietly constructed. Yet he understood something more powerfully now. Truth didn't need constant defense, didn't require shouting or noise. It simply needed quiet, patient persistence, gently pursued, firmly held. Outside, sunlight gently warmed the Capitol's marble steps, reporters calling urgently for comments.
Denzel paused briefly at the top step, calmly observing quietly the waiting media, microphones extended, cameras gently focused upon him. "I have no new statement," he finally said softly, voice steady, calm, resolute. "Just a quiet hope that today reminds us truth can't be silenced simply by louder voices. It waits patiently until we're ready to listen." He stepped quietly away, Marcus following respectfully, leaving behind the noise, uncertainty, and speculation. Quietly, patiently, he walked toward his waiting car, aware deeply that his battle had quietly shifted something fundamental, not through force or accusation, but by patiently, respectfully confronting silence itself. Truth, quietly spoken, patiently held, had quietly triumphed today. And as he stepped gently into the waiting vehicle, notebook quietly in hand, letters held securely within, he felt deeply, quietly certain that whatever battles followed, he was prepared. Because the quietest courage was always the strongest, and the truth was patient enough to wait for it.